I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had an enjoyable and a memorable and meaningful Memorial Day weekend. So we're back, as always, with a very wide-ranging slate of topics. So Emily will kick us off with the actual kind of DC Beltway news of the week, which is the debt limit deal that has been reached by Kevin McCarthy and Joe Biden. Then we'll kick it over to Inez, who's going to talk about a story that may seem a little bit kind of too online in the Twitter weeds, but we think actually has kind of real relevance to you. So we're going to unpack that. It pertains to James Lindsay and the politically prescient moral majority. Then we're going to kick it over to Ben, who's going to talk about how BLM has become the ultimate social justice shakedown. Then I'll kind of zoom out a little bit and close us out with kind of Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday, which happened this past weekend. The Wall Street Journal had kind of a lengthy interview with him turning 100 years old, and we'll kind of get into some lessons from his life and legacy. So let's kick it over to you, Emily, to get us started on the debt limit deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big news of the week here in DC is, actually really nationwide, because there's a potential default hanging in the balance, is whether Congress and the president are able to agree on passing a deal to lift the debt ceiling cap, to raise the debt ceiling cap. And it's exploded, I think, as another fault line on the right. This time, I think it even sort of divides new right and new right, as there's a debate kind of raging over what the appropriate response is in a situation where Biden has accepted a deal brokered by Kevin McCarthy, who again has a very slim majority and also a very, very slim margin for error, given that he, part of being speaker, he gave up on the motion to vacate. So that means that his margin for error is really slim, because they can vacate the chair, they can get rid of him with enough people from his own conference and from even maybe if Democrats wanted to join, that certainly is something that could be on the table. So that deal brokered by Kevin McCarthy has people like Chip Roy, who you may remember was a leader in the fight to get all of these concessions out of Kevin McCarthy during the speakership battle in January. He says, why I will oppose the debt ceiling, quote, deal. It's not a good deal. Some $4 trillion in debt for, at best, a 2-year spending freeze and no serious substantive policy reforms. Hashtag no deal. Now, Newt Gingrich and Ben Shapiro are on the other side of the question. Newt Gingrich has weighed in saying this is a massive win, because none of this was going to happen without Republicans exerting what pressure they could within the realistic context that it was going to be minimal no matter what, because again, their position of negotiation isn't super strong when you just have a slim majority in one chamber of Congress. Ben Shapiro tweets, I agree with every single critique of the shortcomings of the debt limit deal. In a rational world, we wouldn't just be fighting over discretionary spending, we'd be restructuring entitlements. We don't live in that world. Biden is the president, Schumer is the Senate leader. He adds at the end of that thread, also a quick note, you don't get to complain about federal spending and then cheer while Trump and co scream about the possibility of restructuring entitlements. Entitlements represent almost 2/3 of spending, and defense represents another 1/5. So I'm going to kick this open to the group, because I actually think our conversation about this could be really instructive. I don't know, obviously both sides are raising valid points. There was a very slim position of leveraging. Remember, negotiating is necessarily theater, whether you're buying a used car or dealing with the gargantuan federal budget. So one of the reasons you see folks like Chip Roy threatening the motion to vacate right now is precisely because those threats could potentially get a better deal out of the president, who, as Gingrich has pointed out, may have an election year problem on his hands going into 2024 if the United States defaults on debt. A lot of people say, well, Republicans will just be blamed for this. I think Biden knows better that in an election year, a default looks like a leadership problem no matter what. So all of this is to say, this is I think a really legitimate point of contention. Some of it is Republicans trying to squeeze a better deal out of this, and some of it is, I think, an ideological question: why is defense spending going up with no reforms to the Pentagon, while domestic spending is getting frozen, does that still reflect bad priorities on behalf of the Republicans who are negotiating? That's a really good place to leave it open to the group.
So look, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think one thing that Emily pointed out there is very, very important. In fact, I think it's actually crucial to this particular fight. So in the past, especially when there's a Democrat in the White House and Republicans control the Congress, so I think back to kind of the sequestration from the John Boehner fights of 2011 or so. When you have that kind of paradigm, traditionally public polling says that Americans would blame Republicans for default. They would take the side of the Democrat in the White House. The key point here, and this is probably due in no small part due to the unfathomable unpopularity of the doddering senile commander-in-chief in the White House right now, is that the polls that I've seen from Eric Erickson, who's kind of agglomerated them on his Substack and other places, all the polling that I see actually shows that most Americans would blame Biden over House Republicans if the proverbial crap were to hit the fan. I don't know what words we're allowed to say in this family-friendly podcast, and this thing were to ultimately go under. So if you actually have that kind of leverage, if public opinion is actually for once seemingly on the side of House Republicans, and either a plurality or an outright majority of Democrats also want to see more meaningful spending cuts than is currently in this deal that has been reached in principle, with all of that in place here, then I think that this deal is basically woefully inadequate. And, I don't think that deficit hawkishness, like Tea Party era kind of deficit hawkishness, is necessarily kind of the right battle to pick most of the time for conservatives, Republicans in the year 2023. I tend to take a slightly different view of the issues that are more pressing and relevant. And, it's nice that Ben Shapiro is tweeting about entitlement reform, but I mean, that's just simply not a good issue for us to run. And when it comes to entitlement reform specifically, I don't really know how else to say it. There's only so many ways to skin a cat. We've tried that so many times by now. But generally speaking, when it comes to kind of where the American people are lining up in this particular fight, the specific outlines of this deal do seem to me to be totally inadequate. We're recording this on Tuesday. I'm not sure exactly when it will be released. I'm supposed to go on Mark Levin's radio show Thursday evening to debate him. I think partially about Kevin McCarthy. Mark was a huge apologist for Kevin McCarthy against the kind of Chip Roy, Dan Bishop, Andy Biggs gang of 20 back in those early January House Speaker fights. And I'm particularly eager to debate him on this issue this week after what Kevin McCarthy has done to us.
So I'll be brief here on the merits and on the substance. Obviously disappointing that Republicans seemingly did have, in the view of the public, the upper hand here. What was proposed, the supposedly intrepid and sort of aggressive proposal put forth as an opening bid here, in reality was very mild, moderate, and reasonable, talking about going back to spending levels from a couple years ago, as if this is somehow going to leave people impoverished and put millions of federal employees out on the street, et cetera, with all the hysteria that we've come to expect in terms of these battles. So it's obviously disappointing from the perspective of, you had a position which appeared to hold a Republican coalition together, and you were asking the president to blink and didn't hold his feet to the fire. This is consistent with what I think Ace of Spades rightly termed years back failure theater. And, again, a position that could be a strong one, and again, not even on radical grounds, but ultimately snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, to the extent there was ever a true desire to achieve what was laid out in that original proposal. And, I think the bigger question, stepping back, is this about a lack of will or a lack of capability? And at the end of the day, look, Republicans in the House, they can impeach people. That is inordinate power. And so if you're not willing to exert that power to achieve these policy ends, then either you don't really believe in the ends, or you don't believe you can make a compelling case to the American people. And we'd be willing to entertain that argument. I'm sure that Americans aren't willing to deal with any cuts to anything of substance in the federal budget, and even framing it as really genuine, because oftentimes you're talking about lower increases. And also, when we're talking about cutting the federal budget, we're talking about returning money to our hands or future generations' hands. In the first place, since the government has no resources but those which they take from us. But in any event, without getting into the high-minded philosophical arguments and talking about entitlements and the like, I really do think that this comes down to will and capability. And I don't think there was clearly a capability or a will necessarily to make the case to the American people that this is the reasonable, moderate approach and that the president is the extremist here. Clearly that failed. That argument failed within the Republican House. And I think we're going to be the worse off for it.
Yeah, I mean, on that topic of will and being able to actually carry out, I'm not that incensed about this particular fight. That being said, it does seem to me to cast doubt on initially what seemed like substantial leverage for the House Freedom Caucus, right? And that the whole fight about the speakership and those 7 or 8 votes that were taken to elect McCarthy and the potential to call his speakership into question at any point, those don't seem to have helped the House Freedom Caucus actually at the end of the day get a lot of what they initially wanted. So I think that probably that dynamic is more concerning to me than anything about this particular deal, because even as Ben said, I mean, even with the House Freedom Caucus, the original budget or the original debt ceiling plus cuts that came out from the House, it wasn't that, it wasn't going to change the financial trajectory of the country. It wasn't particularly radical in that respect. But it would have said something about the leverage dynamics within the Republican Party if those House Freedom Caucus members had been able to get more of what they wanted. So this seems to put a bit of cold water on the theory that actually the serious part of the caucus with regard to financial matters and budget cuts, the serious part of the caucus does not seem to have the leverage that perhaps we thought or hoped that they would have. But with that, I guess I'll transition to my topic, to myself, and leave Emily out of it for a moment. So initially, what I want to talk about is going to seem like a Twitter thing. We'll get that out of the way. I'll just give the basic details because I think the dynamic underlying does bring out a very important question in the other half of our battles, right, domestically, right? We just talked about the fiscal side. Now we're going to talk about the culture war side. So Yam Hizoni tweeted basically what's wrong with James Lindsay, trying to explicate something that James Lindsay, who has been a very stalwart sort of anti-woke figure on the sort of center left, but has done a lot of work on sort of the intellectual history of this particular ideology, has been turned to by conservative groups, to explain this ideology. He has been a prominent figure on sort of the center right. But he has turned to warning about quote unquote Christian nationalism and how the debate between Christian nationalism and wokeness is going to leave us all completely weakened in this ultimate fight. And I think Yoram did a good job of laying out James Lindsay's argument. To the extent that I agree about any of it with James Lindsay, it's that certainly there is seems like there's an attempt on the left to bait the right into violence. It's not just on this topic, though. It's on any number of topics, right? We've seen that sort of dynamic in the past 2 years many times. So to that extent, I think that there's something to what James is sort of focusing on, but taking the fight to essentially quote unquote Christian nationalism at this point seems to me to be both unfair and a very bad political strategy. And the reason I think that this is a relevant topic for NatCon podcast, right, is because I've said in the past, the culture war is sort of the big tent issue. You are going to bring in, if you start to talk about, for example, minor transitioning, right? Medical transitions, you are going to bring over a lot of moderates, a lot of independent voters, a lot of people who are not conservative and certainly not generally socially conservative. And so there is going to be this fault line then as to how to deal with some of these issues. And unfortunately, I think the James Lindsay tack is quite representative of the way that a lot of center left quote unquote allies are going about this, which is they're looking. They still see the sort of Christian right of the 90s, the moral majority, as quote unquote the bad guys, right? That they feel the need to sort of have a purity politics about allying with social conservatives of the 90s. And they think that there's those social conservatives are still those like backwards rubes, all of the, stereotypes that Democrats and the left have had about the right for quite some time, right? And to me, this overall seems like a very unappealing sort of handout for an alliance, right? Because it seems lunacy to me. I'll put it this way. It seems completely like lunacy to me now when the consequences of mass secularization of society, including atomization, including the breakdown of the family, right, including the sort of drifting away of all of those little platoons that made up the civil society, right, looking around. And then also including this general malaise and feeling of meaninglessness where the West doesn't even want to replicate itself into the future, right? All of these seem to me to at least be arguably connected to secularization, to mass secularization. And it seems totally crazy to me to go backwards now and return to some kind of 2003 new atheist position where we scoff at the moral majority and sort of the dumb Christian rubes. Those dumb Christian rubes were right about almost every one of the social ills that confront us today. They predicted each of those social ills in the 90s. And in fact, to the extent that they were wrong, it's because they didn't predict we would fall down that slippery slope fast enough, right? They thought that we wouldn't get here as quickly as we have gotten here. And so I do think that dynamic is probably going to continue, especially as we do find allies in the moderate left and the IDW and so on things like the T and the LGBT, right? And so I think we are going to have to have some of these debates with our quote unquote allies, because ultimately there's a question of whether the 90s liberalism led inevitably to the wokeness that we experience today, or whether they're two completely discrete phenomena that can be broken apart. With that, I'll throw it back out to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in. I basically agree with everything Inez says, so I'm not really sure and entirely how many kind of new contributions to the conversation I'll have there. Look, I mean, part of this to an extent is kind of questioning the whole notion of an alliance between conservatives, nationalists, Christians, Orthodox Jews, and kind of anti-woke liberals, so to speak, right? I mean, it's kind of questioning to an extent, what we're doing here is questioning this whole kind of purely tactical, not ideologically rooted quasi-alliance that some of us have been trying to kind of put forward for the past few years, when we share a common enemy in the forces of wokeism, anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, and so forth. And there are real kind of underlying tensions here, which were exposed in, from James Lindsay's recent tweets and Yoram's lengthy tweet thread, kind of debunking a lot of what was said in those tweets there. To the substance of what you said, Inez, yeah, I think it's crazy to kind of say to conservative Christians, social conservatives in general, that you should stop. You sound crazy. I mean, I go back all the time to this one. I think it wasn't even an op-ed. It was a blog post that Ross Douthat wrote for the New York Times back in 2015. It was in the lead up to the Obergefell same-sex marriage case at the Supreme Court. And I think the title of the case, I'm paraphrasing maybe here slightly, was "The Wild Ideas of Social Conservatives." And Ross kind of just did a long kind of arc of history kind of survey of the various things that kind of social conservatives have said, going back all the way to the Warren Court era in the middle of last century, where they would say at one point, oh, this will lead to this. And it was laughed at. Oh, no, of course not. And, inevitably it always does, right? I mean, as everyone on this podcast knows, the iron law is not the logical fallacy that they teach you it is in your first year of law school course, or at least that's what I was taught. Rather, it is much more closely analogous to an iron law that very rarely, if ever, fails. Look, there's a lot to be concerned about here. Without getting into details, there's been kind of a very bizarre kind of in the weeds kind of Twitter debate over the past couple of days as well about kind of this Uganda law when it comes to kind of criminalizing certain forms of homosexual activity. And without naming names, I think some of our allies on the right are sounding a little too overly libertarian when it comes to that as well. I'm not prescribing any kind of personal preference for a specific kind of punishment, just kind of the rhetoric that is being floated about more generally speaking. Anyway, we're getting very in the weeds here. But I think this is an important conversation. It does expose some kind of lurking underlying tensions and kind of the broader kind of anti-woke coalition. I think it's worth kind of fleshing that out for those reasons only. We did this also recently. It's worth pointing out as well when Delano was on this podcast subbing in. We did this a little bit as well with kind of, the downsides of kind of the BAP gym rat elements of kind of the distant right as well. So, look, there's a lot of kind of elements of kind of the new right, so to speak, a lot of tensions here.
I think tactically punches are going to need to be pulled, for people who are, who have a different vision of the country and a sort of ordered morality and a moral consensus. I think tactically some punches are going to need to be pulled, but I don't think that should be done in a way that, to quote Reagan, is pale pastels and not bold colors, because, I think what we're up against is truly the evils of postmodernism that is so like baked into the cells of a population right now. So all that is to say, I remember having this conversation over the DeSantis's media dubbed, quote, "Don't Say Gay" bill, which, had some people thinking, well, what's wrong with same-sex couples kissing in Disney films? Why would that be a problem if you don't see an issue with same-sex? Why is that sexualizing? That was the argument that a lot of folks use. It's sexualized a Disney movie, and I think that's actually really interesting because it's sexualizing on the basis that it raises a question for children about what's a norm and what's not, and that gets to the very, very heart, I think, of the opposition here. And so I don't think people should be dishonest about what their ideology is. I don't think people should be, I'm not saying anyone here said that, I'm saying people should be completely honest and upfront about what their faith is and how that informs their political ideology. I think you are going to, even attract more people with those bold colors and not pale pastels. Some people will be turned off. A lot of people will be turned off in the short term. That's why, obviously pulling punches in the short term is somewhat understandable. But I think this is obviously, we agree that this goes really, really deep, and there's no point in sugarcoating it. Jordan Peterson has found enormous success by not sugarcoating any of it, and I think that's a model for other folks as well.
So I'll just say first at the outset, the notion that the regime is going to go after you over XYZ position. Look, everything that the regime disapproves of is not only going to be cast as crazy and dangerous, but also terroristic to the point that actually authorities should be sicked on Americans should they hold the wrong ideas. So I think we ought to stop worrying about how our enemies are going to try to attack us for holding ideas they don't like because those ideas threaten their power and their privilege. That said, of course, in politics, politics is a numbers game. Politics requires judgment and prudence and trying to get as close as you can to the ideal while understanding that we're in a very manifestly imperfect world and the numbers aren't nearly always going to be on our side. And that requires uneasy alliances at times for tactical purposes and strategic purposes. But all that said, we face in some ways a very opportunistic environment, given that the other side is so open and brazen in their extremism, to the point that I'm sure we can all point to anecdotal evidence of this. And obviously then you can see it manifest itself in certain political circumstances, like in Virginia, a year ago, that people in the burbs in moderate or blue, even blue and purplish neighborhoods are incensed at the gender radicalism in schools, for example. I've had those conversations. I'm sure you've had those conversations with peers who are not with us on almost any of these issues. And so that does create huge opportunity. And then it's a question of how you politically exploit that opportunity towards our ultimate goals. And then the last point I'd make is those on the other side want to sow discord among us, and we should always consider that when we're in these heated battles, because they want to see us self-immolate and destruct while they dance towards the goal line. With that, I guess I'll transition back to myself here to talk about one group on the other side, which is BLM, and specifically the Global Foundation, which of course is the tip of the spear of the broader movement. And recently, the Washington Free Beacon did some reporting on their financial disclosures for the 2022 year. And there's some interesting facts to come out of those disclosures. First of all, there was a massive decline in terms of contributions to BLM, which may not be all that surprising given the timing. But in the 2021 period, they brought in $80 million in revenue. In this last year, only $8.5 million. And then they ran an $8.6 million deficit, meaning they spent a lot more than they brought in over the last year. In the last few year period, 2020 to 2022, BLM only gave out a third of the $90 million that they took in to groups, which is way below the percentage typical of charitable foundations. And so you have to ask, where did the money go? Well, we know that past reporting has shown that millions of dollars have been spent on luxury real estate for BLM and its leaders from Los Angeles to Toronto. We know that millions of dollars, according to these disclosures, have gone oftentimes for consulting fees, so-called, or security services fees to the family members of BLM or board members, leaders, and other entities linked to those who were at the top of the organization. And meanwhile, despite what, and also let's note that in Washington and California, BLM, this foundation, had to refrain from running online fundraisers as a consequence of them coming under legal scrutiny for their act as a nonprofit organization. So this raises all sorts of red flags, obviously, potentially of criminal violations. And I wonder where state lawmakers are, state AG's offices and such are on that. Beyond that heavily dubious activity, though, let's note that if this was a total grift and a fraud based on the dubious notion that America is a systemically racist country and cops are basically indiscriminately targeting Blacks and often Black males and killing them on the streets, nevertheless, as our friends at the Claremont Institute found, there have been at least $100 billion dedicated to this cause by Woke Capital Plus, $100 billion to BLM movement and related causes. This is before, of course, we get into government funding for BLM related causes and organizations and such. And that is a massive victory. It's something that I think would be incomprehensible for our side to develop a movement like this, then actually put troops out on the streets essentially for an entire summer of mayhem and destruction of up to $1 to $2 billion, and essentially intimidate all the most influential sectors of society to contribute to their shared cause, rooted in a dubious concept. So even if this is a total fraud and it goes bankrupt, and even if there was ultimately criminal liability for the folks who run the tip of the spear of this cause, nevertheless, it has been hugely successful and effective and radically reoriented basically every influential institution in our society. So, I think it's worth looking at this as a case study in how the left operates and how successful it was. And I'm curious as to your thoughts, but I think it's worth emphasizing and highlighting what has become of this movement a few years on. Despite how it looks on paper in terms of black and red, like a failure potentially financially, it's proven hugely successful, many multiples of what this organization has raised and then plundered for the benefit of those running it. So I just opened up to the group for your thoughts, and I thought this was worth emphasizing and remembering because we're only a few years on now from the start of this movement.
Yeah, I want to jump in on, I think you've hit something quite important. There's a total imbalance in funding between the left and the right. And I'm not talking about like Republican or Democratic numbers in relatively small terms on each election. I'm talking about overall, if you think about the right and the left in this country, once more or less in parity, because the left basically, almost all of the leftist institutions were and continue, a large percentage of them continue to be publicly funded directly through the government, right? Whether that's something like the education system, which is a direct expenditure of the government, or whether it's through grants and so on to all of these NGOs, there's an enormous amount of public money going to the left. So that was once sort of balanced by a relationship between big business and the right. Well, what's happened, as we all know in recent years, is that the right has completely lost big business. Big business is now completely in the column culturally of the left. And so now you have the enormous public investment in the left, you have enormous private investment in the left, and the right has like a few of individual billionaires spending their private money. So there's a huge imbalance there. So, Ben is talking about this $100 billion from World Capital to BLM. Yeah, you can add $800 billion every year going to the K-12 education system, which is almost entirely captured for the cultural left, right? Plus patronage. So you now have both public and private patronage for the left. You point out that this is not a failure. This BLM thing is not a failure. How many people have gotten six-figure jobs because of BLM and the mentality around BLM in the last 2 or 3 years? A lot of people, right? A lot of HR consultants, a lot of DEI consultants, right? The left has created an entire ecosystem of people who are dependent on leftist ideology for their jobs and their money. And this is a huge problem. It's why the right needs to get serious about allocating public money to our own institutions. This is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about school choice. I think it's incredibly important, not only that we give people a choice to opt out of this obviously failed education system, but on the flip side, it's very important that we start writing very big checks out of the Treasury to alternative institutions, like, for example, private classical schools, right? There is an inherent imbalance. We're always going to be playing on a massively tilted table when it comes to money, unless we start to get serious about at least utilizing the portion of the public fisc that rightfully belongs to us as taxpayers.
It's such a complete condemnation of our media that this all happened under their noses, and scrappy conservative outlets are the only people reporting on this, while the well-funded, massive so-called mainstream institutions, corporations, have basically little skepticism or criticism and actually were promoting these organizations and promoting these programs. And I think everything Inez says raises a point to come full circle with the first block. Someone on the left said something very interesting to me recently about the battles that conservatives chose to pick in these McCarthy negotiations. One of which being age limits for food stamps, raising that from 49 to 54 on a gradual scale. There are a lot of these programs at the Pentagon. There are a lot of these programs baked into the federal government all over the place, and they were fueled by the Biden budget in certain instances. I'm curious as to why none of them were front and center in these negotiations, and especially those that are at the Pentagon. I think these are obvious platform priorities that bridge, as Russ Vogt has talked about, the sort of spending fights with the culture fights in a very obvious way. So I really think this is the next frontier for the new right and for the Republican Party. But this was an indication that it hasn't quite seeped in the way that it should yet.
Yeah, I'm happy you mentioned Russ Vogt, actually. Very happy. I almost mentioned him. I probably should have in our earlier segment on the debt limit. It was Russ who actually first outlined his current proposal, which is kind of for conservatives to focus not so much on the third rail topic of entitlements, but focus on basically gutting wokeism wherever it raises its very ugly head within the various confines of the administrative state. He first proposed that, if I recall correctly, in a Newsweek op-ed that we edited back in February. So that op-ed's gotten a ton of play for us. And, I think Russ actually has now come out against the debt limit fight, or against the deal reached between McCarthy and Biden, which is very interesting. Anyway, that is a very nice way to tie these segments together. Look, Black Lives Matter is ultimately rooted in an ahistorical claim about the American founding. It is based on a revisionist history retconning of America that is at irreconcilable loggerheads with the actual facts of our history, and merely serves to kind of to better further their fairly nefarious, open and explicit purposes of undermining the country and ultimately the Western civilization. So given all of that, I find it wholly unsurprising that large swaths of the organization and the broader movement are themselves rooted in grifterdom, or whatever kind of the noun version of being just a big fat grift is. But these stories have been trickling out for years now, right? About how kind of all the founders of BLM have lived in these Tony mansions and $1 million Beverly Hills kind of places here. Claremont has done a great job. Arthur Millick and the DC crew have done a great job of exposing the extent to which corporate America has been totally complicit and swindled. I think $82 billion was the number, if I recall, from the study that Claremont put out a couple of days ago in total corporate America contributions to BLM. So it's very nefarious stuff. And, you know, ultimately, not to beat a dead horse, but like unless and until we actually put some sort of constitutionally kosher constraints on the extent to which all of this is permissible using the actual hard tool of legislation, I fear that it will only continue. Okay, so let's transition to our final segment. It's a bit of a rough transition, admittedly. So Henry Kissinger turned 100 years old this past weekend. The Wall Street Journal had a brief editorial on his legacy, and then they had kind of a lengthier weekend interview with him that I read and I found very interesting. So, you know, he's 100 years old, but it's interesting. His name really kind of carries a certain level of cachet, I think, to this day when it comes to international relations, grand strategy, geopolitics, foreign policy in general. It's very interesting because he actually only served in the U.S. government for 8 years, I believe, over the course of the Nixon and Ford administrations. But, you know, people still talk about him to this day. And he really, to an extent, does kind of come from a bygone era, which is an era where he was forged through the fire, not just in World War II, but after that, during kind of the Cold War years, he was forged in the crucible of great power competition. And, you know, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, I was born in 1989. I was literally born the year that the Berlin Wall fell. So all that I have ever known until arguably the past few years with the, you know, ever increasing rise of China, all I ever knew was kind of, you know, unilateral American hegemony all around the world. But Kissinger is a real throwback, and he's a real throwback to kind of an age of great power competition, where, of course, the name of the game was the United States versus the Soviet Union. And he had a lot of policies around that time that didn't necessarily sit super well with a lot of kind of, you know, more assertively moralistic foreign policy thinkers, we might say, with the kind of folks who kind of would bristle at his ideas of détente, for instance. Détente was really kind of a Kissinger-led policy. It was Kissinger who also kind of had the vision to get Richard Nixon ultimately to go to Beijing and meet with Chairman Mao, which ultimately was quite successful in not necessarily obviously pulling China into the American sphere of influence, but at least in kind of pulling them away from the Soviet sphere of influence. Whether that was good policy on kind of a 50 to 100 year scale is something that, you know, I'm a little less certain of that, to put it mildly. But at the time, I think it was very, very difficult to fault them. And it really was kind of quite successful, probably, and ultimately kind of expediting the ultimate end of the Cold War. Just one thing, or really maybe a couple of things, but one thing that I wanted to kind of highlight from this interview that I actually did take issue with. So Kissinger says this to his interviewer. He says, quote, "The American view of itself is righteousness," says the man famed for his realpolitik. "We believe we are unselfish, that we have no purely national objectives, and also that our national objectives are achieved in foreign policy with such difficulty that when we expose them to modification through discussion, we get resentful of opponents. We do expect that our views will carry the day, not because we think we are intellectually superior, but because we think the views in themselves should be dominant." The latter part, I think, is all right, but I have to say, I actually object to the first part of that quote, and maybe that would be an interesting way to kind of tee off the discussion for the group here. So to kind of go back to the beginning, he says, quote, "We believe we are unselfish, that we have no purely national objective, and also that our national objectives are achieved, blah, blah, blah." I'd be curious what you guys think about Kissinger's claim. Remember here that Kissinger is supposed to be the great realist. He's supposed to be kind of in fairly stark contrast with kind of the liberal humanitarian, Samantha Power-esque foreign policy thinkers on the left, and also with kind of the, you know, Bill Kristol-esque neoconservative thinkers on the right here. So I personally actually find it troubling. I agreed with most of his interview in the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, and obviously he's turning 100. I mean, kind of give the guy some credit, to be clear. But I did find it troubling, this notion that America has, quote, no purely national objectives when it comes to foreign policy. To me, that's kind of hearkening back to kind of this uniparty idea of America as just kind of an abstract idea, not a concrete people. And I think it certainly kind of differs from kind of the NatCon view of American foreign policy, which should be kind of this hard-headed emphasis on very narrowly pursuing the American national interest and national objectives. So I don't know. That's kind of a lot to throw out there, but I'd be curious just for your takes on all of that.
Josh was like, I think sort of uncertain as to whether to do this topic, if I may say that, but I think it was perfect. I actually think it's really well worth reflecting on the legacy of arguably the most influential living American who's had just an astounding life trajectory. It's like Forrest Gump everywhere that Henry Kissinger has been, except Forrest Gump is sort of obviously ostensibly passive, but turns out to be not so passive. Whereas Henry Kissinger is very much not passive in any way whatsoever in all of the events that he sort of witnessed firsthand. We did a segment over on Counterpoints last week about new reporting on Cambodia and Kissinger's role in orchestrating some violence in Cambodia. Obviously, most people are familiar with what happened in the 1970s, and that's why I think it's absolutely worth pausing and listening to absolutely everything everyone has to say about Henry Kissinger, because weighing the actions and the morality of the actions of Henry Kissinger is really weighing the morality of a lot of steps that the country has done, and weighing the system and understanding the system in a post mid-century country where a lot of war powers are delegated to the executive branch in ways they hadn't been in the past. So I am actually really glad we did this topic because I think what Josh said was interesting and fascinating and very, very relevant. And I'll kick it open to the rest of the group right now too.
I'll address the section you pulled out, Josh, from the Wall Street Journal interview. I read this quite differently, I guess, than you did. I didn't read it as an endorsement of, say, Bill Kristol-esque kind of foreign policy. I read it almost as a critique of the country itself. And that is that America is not a natural to great power politics or empire, right? These things don't come naturally to Americans and to the American mentality, in part because we were once a colony, right? And in part that because like the formation of America very much always envisioned us. Well, I shouldn't say that, because there are definitely founders that did envision us, like Alexander Hamilton, but many people at the founding of this country did not really envision the kind of sprawling empire or the amount of power, even forgetting for a moment about empire, the amount of like global power that America would ultimately wield after World War II. I think we were simply not prepared for. We haven't had generations administering an empire like the Brits, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire. We don't have a particular sort of interest in learning about other cultures and people. There is a quote unquote ugly American stereotype for a reason. Americans do tend to stumble into things around the world. We do see ourselves, I think, primarily as great because we are good. We have this sort of identity between the sort of domestic virtues of America and her foreign sort of adventures. And all of that, I think, is very, very complicated at this one moment. As we've talked about before, there's a very real fear, I think, for those of us in this kind of corner of the right, that America could become an evil empire, right? That if we lose that fight for goodness at home, it will also consequently mean that we are imposing that vision on the world in the same way that we are now, imposing the sort of woke trans stuff around the world and running the trans flag up our embassies in various countries and so on, right? So there is this very real sense that whoever we are at home has consequences for the globe. And I think that's how I read that section of the interview, which was very interesting to read at 100, Henry Kissinger at 100. But that's kind of how I read it, less as an endorsement of a particular foreign policy and more with these kind of existential questions that Americans, we don't like to think of ourselves in this way. And nevertheless, America does have an enormous amount of power around the world. So that's kind of what I saw him pointing to.
Yeah, just I guess on the point about power, I would say that there's a question of what is the purpose of the power. And to me, it ought to be to keep America a free and independent nation so that we can operate in the way we wish to operate in accordance with our strategic objectives and our national interest. And unfortunately, our ruling class has defined those objectives and our national interest in ways that I think we all probably would argue are completely antithetical to our national interest and will ultimately leave us more dependent and more unfree and I guess at very best, from the perspective of our ruling class, outsource those very regressive ideas, institutions, and policies so that the world looks more like the dystopic world that the ruling class wishes to impose upon us. I would point to one other section of the interview, and there may also be different interpretations in terms of how you read it, but it came to my attention when Bridge Colby tweeted out a portion of it, and he said, Henry Kissinger's ideal solution is China dominating Asia. That's his read of Kissinger. And Kissinger says, quote, Beijing expects to be the dominant power in Asia. The ideal solution is a China so visibly strong that that will occur through the logic of events. And Kissinger goes on to talk about how if China looks incredibly strong, then Japan will essentially build weapons of mass destruction, i.e. nuclear weapons, increase its stockpile, and this will probably, I guess, and from his perspective, then lead to some sort of balancing and other Asian powers, burden sharing, I would guess, would be one way to read it. But I share Bridge Colby's skepticism and alarm at the idea that it's ideal for China to be the dominant power in Asia. And unfortunately, this is consistent with kind of Kissinger's long-run view, although if you go back and you look when he was talking about the Sino-Soviet split, he spoke about the fact that now we need to counterbalance Russia. He did say, however, in writings, in cables that you can look at, or minutes of his conversations with Nixon at the time, contemporaneously, that at some point down the road, China might become the more dominant power and we may need to switch, essentially. And he was right on that. But we have never made that switch. And maybe impossible, and Russia might never work with us, especially at this point in connection with that switch. But he did seem to recognize the danger of a dominant China. Yet, by the same token, he's supported the policies largely that have ultimately led China to be the most formidable adversary we've ever faced. And he's enriched himself as a consequence of it through his consultancy. So that's a devastating part of the entire legacy when looked at 100 years later. And I'm sure he would have counter arguments against what I've raised. But this, to me, was a particularly alarming part of the interview. The ideal solution of China being the dominant power in Asia is a very scary one.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well. No doubt about that. Maybe we can continue that in final thoughts, maybe not, but we should move to final thoughts. So who wants to get us started?
I can jump in there because I was actually, as Ben was saying that, I was, that's exactly what I was preparing to mention for final thoughts. Henry Kissinger has made a lot of money off China in the last several decades, a lot of money. We don't actually really know how much, and we don't know exactly doing what. But I think that's worth remembering, and it's worth taking a step back and realizing that's kind of, again, the story of America over the last several decades. And people are now, I think, starting to, it was rich hearing that from Henry Kissinger. And it's rich to hear Henry Kissinger, for instance, say that we need to take our foot off the gas when it comes to Taiwan after what he has spent the last several decades doing. I think that's completely worth pausing and thinking about. And that's why I think, as a final thought, I just wanted to say, I've been pondering lately a lot of the Cold War legacy and fusionism, as I know many of us have, but how much of that goes directly back to the invention of nuclear technology, and how the decisions of people like Henry Kissinger in Cambodia, he himself talks about how liberating camps from World War II was an absolutely visceral personal experience that informed the rest of his life, that haunted the rest of his life. And you can understand how the very, very sudden invention of a destruction on a mass scale sort of set foreign policy, not just from the United States, but from the West and from the East, in the direction that it went over the last 100 years. And I feel like our heads have been spinning and reeling for a century. And now we can take a step back and say, this is a sort of world order that was forged in panic. And that's not to say we shouldn't still be panicked about nuclear potential, but it is to say that we can have all of these conversations about foreign policy niches and realism versus neoconservatism versus internationalism, but our discussions of those all revolve around the central question of nuclear technology. There's absolutely no way around it. That is the single thing that has forged those conversations, and I think that's why it needs to be central to our conversations right now, and not sometimes downstream or secondary to those other questions, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. We all live in constant fear of a major nuclear power launching, we see this with Putin right now, launching a nuclear strike.
So I'll comment really briefly on a tangentially related subject, which is we obviously did just remember for Memorial Day, and I went and attended a ceremony, a local ceremony with a number of veterans and family. And let me just say, it's a challenging experience, to say the least, to try to explain the significance of it to a toddler. But in thinking through how you explain the significance of Memorial Day to a toddler, it did cause me to reflect on maybe a tension that exists, which is the more that we know about the operations of particularly leadership in the national security and foreign policy apparatus now, and even historically, when we look at revisionist history, it can cause us to become very jaded and cynical. And I think probably rightly so. That's probably always the way to look at any institution which is in any way controlled by politics or at minimum responsive to politics. But by the same token, it is very important to distinguish between the top ranks, the leadership, and why and how they make the decisions that they do, from the actual soldiers who go out and execute and operate, even when they disagree with the decisions of the leadership, and even in pursuit of sometimes clearly fruitless and misbegotten and poorly conceived missions. And so, I think we continue to forever owe a debt of gratitude to those who fight, even if those who send them to war oftentimes do so for the wrong reasons, in the wrong places at the wrong times, and in the wrong ways. Nevertheless, thank God we have people who are willing to put their lives on the line to fight and defend our freedom and independence.
Yeah, I mean, obviously second everything that Ben said. I've had some of those same, been thinking through some of those same tensions this Memorial Day, and similar kind of remembrances, both with regard to the military and then also for 9/11, for example. Things seem much less clear-cut morally than they used to, I think, in the 90s and 2000s, and that's part of how we celebrate these holidays today, is thinking through, I think, some of those tensions that you brought up. So well taken. I wanted to just go and add my kudos for reading this piece over at Compact Magazine called "The Soft Tyranny of Modern Medicine" by Akshay Pendyal. I'm sorry to butcher your name there. It has, the normal, what you might expect for Compact. It has the sort of nods to a certain kind of material socialism here and there in it. But I think the essence of this piece is something really important to think through. It describes this kind of capital P progressive technocratic mentality. And that's interesting enough as applied within the field of medicine, but I think it's also true more broadly speaking. People treat, for example, the eugenics craze at the turn of the century among progressives as sort of this embarrassing offshoot, sort of misbegotten intellectual redheaded stepchild, right, of the progressive era. But I think as you read through this piece, you'll understand why that is integrated into this larger worldview that imagines that basically we have bust the bonds of the human condition, right? Or if we haven't, then we shortly will. And there's this kind of unshakable belief in progress, in technological progress and scientific progress, being able to solve the great sort of sorrows of mankind. And so I think that it's just a good read into that mentality. I think that mentality is very much a victor today in a kind of center-left neoliberalism that actually runs most of the actual government, and is now being sort of fused with an actual religion, the wokeness, right? And that coexists sometimes in tension with this kind of centrist neoliberal view of the world. But in any case, I think it is a interesting look at that mentality in medicine worth reading, and that's in Compact Magazine.
So I'll go a little off script, which is kind of why I want to go last here. So one thing that Memorial Day weekend always does for me, I agree with everything Ben said, honor the fallen. And, it's a whole nother conversation about kind of the tensions between kind of honoring the fallen and these just horrific kind of aimless meandering boondoggles that the foreign policy bipartisan establishment has so often kind of commanded over the past few decades. But one other thing totally unrelated to that Memorial Day weekend always does for me personally is drive home the importance of sports, actually, in the lives in the life of me and probably in the lives of many other American patriots. So it's always one of the greatest kind of sports weekends, in my opinion, of the calendar year, at least for those like me who follow a bunch of different sports. So on Sunday, you have the Indianapolis 500, the greatest kind of American kind of pageantry in all of auto racing. You also have the Monaco Grand Prix in Formula One, which is the greatest kind of auto race in the world if you're into the Formula One kind of Euro stuff like me, but let's stick to America for now. So you have the Indianapolis 500. Then you also have the NCAA men's lacrosse national championship is always on Monday. My beloved Duke Blue Devils unfortunately fell to Notre Dame on Monday. And then you have the NBA finals as well here. On a personal note, I've kind of converted to being a Miami Heat fan since moving here, and I was pretty pleased to see the Heat take down the Celtics in Game 7 up in Boston. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. The point that I want to make, and kind of just this visceral reminder, as I have been kind of glued to my television over the past couple of days, at least when I wasn't out on the golf course here, is it kind of just it got me thinking a little bit about kind of NatCon, American greatness, and sports. I'm trying to kind of I don't have kind of like a 30-point kind of memo or anything here, but I wonder if there's some way to kind of connect the idea of kind of, a more kind of robust, kind of muscular, kind of American greatness, kind of, fly the flag style, rah-rah nationalism with kind of an emphasis on actual hard investing in sports. And we really need like actual patriots to do this, of course, because all too often, and I am the first one to, this has happened to Ben, to me, to so many of us who grew up as diehard sports fans. So many of us have started to kind of tune away over the past few years as Black Lives Matter and all these woke causes have just totally corrupted. I mean, there was this terrible incident down in Los Angeles recently where the LA Dodgers totally capitulated to this vehemently anti-Catholic, group of de facto Satanists who are going to go to Dodger Stadium out there and just basically mock. It's really just gross stuff. But I wonder if there's some way for kind of NatCons to kind of turn the table. And, unfortunately, that would involve dollars that we do not currently have. Maybe it would be better used at some sort of state level. But there's definitely something to be said about kind of the Venn diagram overlap between kind of a renewed patriotism, a renewed nationalism, and kind of an emphasis on the greatness and grandeur of individual athletes and team athletes. I mean, we see this sometimes in the Olympic Games. The Olympics have their own sorts of kind of, fraught international geopolitics, as do many of these international sports like FIFA do and whatnot there. But anyway, this past weekend kind of just got me thinking. It's kind of this great kind of side-by-side juxtaposition between kind of athletics and Memorial Day and the Stars and Stripes and all of that. So I wonder if there's something here, some sort of grist for possible future conversation about maybe some sort of kind of investments in kind of restoring American grandeur, and also kind of a very, very much needed re-imbuing of the fabric of American sports with patriotism, not Black Lives Matter and wokeism. But anyway, on that note, we've had a very long, winding conversation this week. Hope you've all enjoyed it. So on behalf of Ben, Inez, and Emily, I'm Josh Hammer. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.